Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Carpenter Hall in the... I'll do it off the mic then. Good afternoon. Welcome to Carpenter Hall in the Festival Noon Lecture Series, Art and Community Dialogue. Am I on? Perfect. Art and Community Dialogue Series. My name is Tara Doherty. On behalf of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in here today, especially on a Sunday. This is a special treat to have this in lieu of a park talk. The OSF Living Ideas Art and Community Dialogue Series is a new humanities-based program that explores the local impacts of global issues and seeks to forge connections between individuals and communities through collaborative programming centered on topics inspired by the works on the festival stages. Information about the Festival Noon and the Living Ideas Art and Community Dialogue Series can be found at osfashland.org/living ideas. We have flyers in the front of Carpenter Hall that look like this. This year, we've chosen to focus this Living Ideas Art and Community Dialogue Series on Sweat by Lynn Nottage, which is an amazing play and the topic on which Harry will speak today. A few upcoming events. Wednesday, September 2nd, we'll have a conversation, An Actor's Process, Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, featuring Christiana Clark. Thursday, September 3rd, we'll have another Living Ideas panel discussion, So You Got a Job, Sweat in the Crafting of an American Deindustrialization Story, featuring members from the cast of Sweat. And then Friday, September 4th, we'll have a lecture/demonstration, Edmond Dantes and the Sword, Fight Choreography in the Count of Monte Cristo, with you, Jonathan Topo, resident fight director, and Al Espinoza, Edmond Dantes. Tickets for these events and more can be purchased downstairs in the box office. I just also want to make another note. We're live streaming today's lecture, so hello to anyone on the World Wide Web that is joining us. We'll have the links online. Also, we'll be streaming the Thursday panel with the Sweat actors. And at 12:45 today, we'll have a short pause for you to allow for you to travel to the 1 p.m. performance of Long Day's Journey into Night and the 1:30 performances of Guys and Dolls. We ask that you pass quietly as to not interrupt the end of the lecture. And finally, please set your cell phones to silent, and we ask that you not take photos during the lecture. Today, I have the immense honor of introducing Harry J. Elam Jr., who is the Olive H. Professor in the Humanities and the Freeman Thornton Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at Stanford University. He is author of Taking It to the Streets, the social protest theater of Luis Valdez and Amiri Baraka, and the Errol Hill Prize-winning The Past as Present in the Drama of August Wilson, and co-editor of 5 books, African American Performance and Theater History, A Critical Reader, Colored Contradictions, an anthology of contemporary African American drama, The Fire This Time, African American Plays for the New Millennium, Black Cultural Traffic, Crossroads in Performance and Popular Culture, and the Methuen Anthology of Post-Bac Drama. His articles have appeared in American Theater, American Drama, Modern Drama, Theater Journal, Text and Performance Quarterly, as well as the journals in Belgium, Israel, Poland, and Taiwan. He has also written essays published in several critical anthologies. In 2006, Professor Elam was the winner of the Betty Jean Jones Award for Outstanding Teacher from the American Theater and Drama Society, the winner of Excellence in Editing Award from the Association of Theater and Higher Education, and the winner of the Distinguished Scholar Award from the American Society of Theater Research. He was also inducted into the College of Fellows of the American Theater in April 2006. In addition to his scholarly work, he's directed professionally for over 20 years, most notably Todd, The Boy Todd, by Talvin Wilkes for the Oakland Ensemble Company. He has directed several other of August Wilson's plays, including Joe Turner's Come and Gone, Two Trains Running, and Fences, the latter of which won 8 Bay Area Choice Awards. He is here today to present his lecture, The Theater of Lynn Nottage, a Retrospective. Please join me in welcoming Harry J. Elam Jr.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Tara, for that introduction. And I also want to say thank you to Russell for all his work in setting up and making it possible for you to hear me. And Robert for inviting us here. Yesterday, my wife lectured, and it's wonderful to be able to lecture with your wife on the same subject. We taught a class together at Stanford, and that was a lot of fun. It was a class where 2 people usually taught, and they had intellectual arguments on stage, but we worried that the students wouldn't know how to deal with that with a married couple. So we had intellectual harmony on stage. So it was interesting to hear her talk and see how it goes with mine. And it was great seeing Sweat last night. Show of hands, how many people have seen Sweat? Great. Loved it? Yes? Powerful? Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of that New York Times review and everything about it, it lived up to that, all the hype in terms of seeing it last night. So I will talk about Sweat, but I'll talk about it in the context of thinking about her work more generally. And at the end, if there's time, we'll talk about and then show you potentially a clip of a thing called her project, the Reading Project, that she calls This is Reading, which is an exciting installation project. So it's taking theater to an interactive, a different level that she's thinking about in Reading. So, Lynn Nottage. As we know, Lynn Nottage is a MacArthur Award-winning playwright, a multi-award-winning playwright. In fact, she's a playwright who has been lauded as a new voice, an important new voice on the American stage. More than that, her plays have been done all over the country in regional theater. She's one of the most popular contemporary playwrights in terms of production. In addition to that, she's been more recently a playwright that's read in colleges around the country. So that sense of her work is getting out there and it made her important. Now, she's popular not simply because of her commercial success, but her ability to potently blend politics and race, class and gender within her work, to explore their interactions. And through examining the truth and depth of characters beyond the matters of identity in compelling ways that look beyond the surface, that provoke and evoke thought, as they ask audiences to reconsider their own cultural suppositions and baggage. And that sense of reconsidering ourselves, I want to talk about in relationship to Sweat. Now, Nottage's plays do not fit a simple mode. The style of the plays are quite different. So unlike August Wilson, who you may have seen other plays of, she's not someone who there's a relationship between the plays directly. She's not someone who's building a cycle of plays where they directly speak to what happened in African American history or the form relates to each other. The forms of her plays are very, very different. Has anybody seen Intimate Apparel? Well, clearly, right? Very different from this play. Or Ruined. How many people saw Ruined up here as well? So you see, these are plays that in terms of their style and form and structure are different from each other. And so she says, when she was talking about Intimate Apparel in relationship to the play that followed that, Fabulation, my agent came to see the first preview of Fabulation. When he sat down, he heard someone say to the person next to him, "You're in for a treat. You're going to see really well-wrought, complex characters." And he thought, "Oh, no, you aren't." And Charlene Woodward, who played the lead in, the character's name is Undine in Fabulation, was surprised when she read the play. She said, "It's totally different playwright from the one who wrote Intimate Apparel. The play's a little dangerous, a little politically incorrect." Now, Nottage herself calls her work, or sees herself as, quote, "a contemporary playwright in a postmodern world." A contemporary playwright in the postmodern. Now, what does that mean? Well, the postmodern part is an interesting one because the postmodern speaks to that sense of fragmentation, difference, that things don't necessarily have to align in a logical form. Postmodern is often seen to be separate from political. And one of the points I want to make with you today is that there's a politics within her work, and she is very, very interested in the political. So that part of the postmodern, there's a guy named Phil Auslander who talks about the postmodern politics of resistance. And hers is something within that within the form of the play, she's resisting certain things, be it capitalism, other things that we'll talk about in a bit. But at the same time, within the structure, she, in some ways, because it happens in a place like this that is about theater and bringing audience in, embraces capitalism at the same time. So it's an interesting dynamic. But the postmodern, one of the things that I want to stress here is that sense of it meaning that the works are different. Now, the contemporary part of that, a contemporary playwright, what's the contemporary part? Well, it's her experimentation with form. And in this play, I think one of the things that's interesting about it is it's an ensemble play, right? There's not one star. There's this sense of the whole cast working together within that. And that's a very old formula that we saw in what's called the contemporary period. Back in the 60s, the 70s, you might see a play like this. So it has that sense of an old feel with a situation that's new, that's speaking to now and to today, and concerns that we have in about the political climate today. So that's what I think that quote in terms of the politics of the contemporary and the postmodern meets. So here, within her work, even as the plays are different, I want to suggest to you that there's some themes that are shared in her plays. And I'll talk through those themes. The first one is the import of history. The second one, the aftermath of crisis. What happens in the aftermath of crisis? How does the characters, in a sense, confront the rest of their life? What do they find out? And we see crisis. Somebody shout out, well, crisis, what's the crisis we see, or crises that we see in Sweat? Loss of jobs. Yeah. So that crisis on a more wider scale in terms of the politics, and you have the individual crisis that happens in that sort of act that you can't even speak about, that we know that happened from the beginning of the play. We're going to find out what happened in terms of that act. Also, the dynamics of race and class. And finally, the potential for hope and redemption. I think that's a really important idea within her work. The idea that love, that hope, that there's a space for people to redeem themselves. So let's go and let's look at this first idea, the import of history. So one of the compelling themes in Nottage's work is exactly this, is that she examines history and she thinks about the impact of the past on the present. So unlike August Wilson, who eschewed historical research, Nottage's work relies on research and gathering of data. She spent hours in the New York Public Library researching the early 90s before writing Intimate Apparel. And she went on, in terms of Ruined, she went to Uganda to interview the Congolese refugees who inspired the characters in the play. And she says, quote, "I traveled to East Africa to interview Congolese women fleeing the armed conflict in the how about the Democratic Republic of the Congo? I was fueled by my desire to tell the story of war, but through the eyes of women who, as we know, rarely start conflicts, but inevitably find themselves right smack in the middle of them. I was interested in giving voice and audience to African women living in the shadows of war." And I think that play does that powerfully. In her play, Sweat, she spoke with blue-collar workers in Reading whose lives were upended by factory closings that left with no work, no money, no chance. Just as she did with Ruined, so she set about with Sweat. So I set about in December to find, and it's interesting, but before I read this quote, to say that she was involved in the Occupy movement and wanted to give some real practice to things she was seeing there, and wanted to become involved in a sense through what she does, the politics of her art. So I set about in December to find a city that I felt was a microcosm of what was happening in America. And because I live in New York, I thought, let me find a city that's within driving distance. The New York Times had written an article about Reading, which was then designated as the poorest city in all of America. I found it really fascinating that one of the poorest cities was in the Northeast, because we usually think of the Rust Belt, we think of the South. But the poverty is so close to us. In fact, 6 of the poorest cities in America were in the Northeast, in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. I thought, we have a warped perception of what poverty is. In January 2012, I began traveling to Reading with a small team of people just to figure out what is the demographic of this city, what is the narrative of this city. It also coincided with the election of a first African-American mayor in the city, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's like Obama. When things are really bad, everyone feels like, finally, you can inherit the mess. So we began trying to interview everyone from legislators to the police force to social services to people on the street. It's what we did with Ruined. We sort of went and immersed ourselves, and we ended up going back and forth and establishing some very close ties with the people in town, with some of the people in social services, with some of the homeless people, with some of the people in the arts community. So that's what she did in the background, using these actual events, actual stories, whatever, to create a history. So you could see her, in a sense, using history, but also making history through the power of theater. And interestingly, it's a history that is idiosyncratic and personal. My wife called it bottom-up history yesterday. So it's not about major historical figures, but rather gives weight and substance to the stories of minor figures that traditionally travel below the radar. And at the same time, within that, we see wonderfully, in terms of the set design of the play, we see how that history of NAFTA, of the election, of the crash of 2008 figures in the background. And we see it on the screens. We also see sports. I was at one point trying to watch the game, but it was getting me off track in terms of what I should have been doing. Set in 1905, Intimate Apparel, for example, relates the life of a black seamstress who sews intimate clothing for white women, some wealthy and some of ill repute. Now, her play, Crumbs at the Table of Joy, focuses in on a black family as the site of personal and collective history. Set in 1950s Brooklyn, Crumbs embraces history as it operates through a series of flashbacks, and we see flashbacks again in Sweat. Like Tennessee Williams' Glass Menagerie, Crumbs from the Table of Joy revolves around memories orchestrated by a central character. Nottage's young female narrator, Ernestine, and you can see the daughter here, replaces Williams' Tom. She works to escape the control of her father rather than the will and commands of her mother, as Tom does in Glass Menagerie. Ernestine Crump speaks through direct address directly to the audience, offering commentary and at times views of events that she wished had transpired rather than those that did take place. Now, another interesting play in terms of history use is this one, Las Meninas, that it turns to the 1600s and the court of Louis XIV and a taboo relationship with the queen and an African dwarf. So has anyone here seen that play? I've only read it. I have not seen it perform. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with the dwarf. With Sweat, the flashbacks of recent history of 2000 and 2008 figure prominently, as we talked about. So recent history is known, and as a result, we have to think about what happened. So as we watch Sweat, right, we know what happened in 2000. We know what happened in 2008 and the crash. So the inevitability of that shapes some of the action of the play. And in that way, you could say, in somewhat, it's reminiscent of Greek tragedy, where you know the end, where everybody knows the story, or Shakespeare in terms of his history plays. So what's happening then within the use of history is not so much about simply the content, but yes, about the content, but how the telling goes, how she structures the story, where she's going to take us in learning about this unspeakable act, in learning too how the politics of the social situation at that time, what happened in 2000, what happened in 2008 is going to impact on everything else. That brings us to the question of in the aftermath of crisis. So what I'd argue is that Nottage characters are survivors, often caught in impossible situations. So what do you do in the aftermath of crisis or trauma? What actions can you take to make yourself whole? The power to overcome, the indomitability of spirit, the resilience of the characters is something we see in the plays. So in Crumbs of the Table of Joy, the crisis that we see in the aftermath is that the death of his wife, Godfrey Crump's wife in Crumbs, precipitates he and his two daughters heading to New York in search of a different life and some sort of spiritual salvation. So in the aftermath of crisis, he's looking to the spirit for spirituality. He finds a life of economic segregation and secondhand status in the workplace. Godfrey finds spiritual sustenance in Father Divine, a historical figure from the past. Father Divine. Father Divine represents a moral conservatism and a social complacency. Still, what Godfrey seeks through Father Divine is an integration of spirituality and politics. He reaches out for religious solutions to his personal, social, and racial problems. Fabulation and Intimate Apparel, both plays she was writing at the same time. What Lynn Nottage herself says, that the focus of these plays are about African women in existential self-crises. So she puts them in that crisis, and we see the aftermath within it. They both have a weakness for charming men. In my family history, she says, there are generations of women who were abandoned by men. It's one of the themes of my family. But the way she constructs the play in which the female protagonists deal with this question of the aftermath is decidedly different in Fabulation versus Intimate Apparel. Fabulation is a satirical fable. Intimate Apparel is a lyrical meditation on one woman's loneliness and desire. Fabulation she calls very fast-moving, a fast-paced play for the MTV generation. Now, in the figure of Esther, the central figure in Intimate Apparel, she's an illiterate religious woman. She finds both bittersweet love and the will to survive despite the pain of betrayal. It takes place in Lower Manhattan in 1905. The main character, Esther, 35-year-old seamstress, as I talked before about the work she does, she lives alone in a boarding house, and she works tirelessly on creating custom-made lingerie. Straddling the worlds, Esther yearns for love. But the most romance we see in her lonely life affords her is the stories of origins and exotic fabrics she buys from an Orthodox Jewish supplier, Mr. Marx. And if you saw the play, their bittersweet romance that almost is but can't be is wonderful in terms of the spirit of the play and what propels it. Marx also, they both together face racial prejudice and cultural stereotypes and traditions that prevent them from acting on their mutual attraction. So within that sense of their mutual attraction, lying behind it, and this happens within this idea of the aftermath of crisis, there's a question, what if? What if we got together? What if they did? So that sort of lingers in the audience mind, in their mind, and it lingers within the plays. What happens to her within her exchanges with him and her dream of one day opening her own beauty salon sustained her, and she receives a letter from George, a Barbadian laborer working on the Panama Canal, who she asks to correspond with her. Esther welcomes this romantic advance, but her position is complicated by her illiteracy, and so she's got to rely on someone to write her letters. The relationship flourishes through the letters. Eventually, George comes to New York and marriage to marry her, and marriage to George, however, proves different than she imagined. And it is through the way that Esther navigates this relationship that Nottage comments on issues of race, on women's use of, on women's self-worth, and the struggle against compromising one's dream. I should tell you about this picture of this production of it. The guy there, his name is Sterling Brown. Alice Rayner, a colleague of mine, we both taught him back at Stanford, and his life story is sort of a Lynn Nottage play, so I'm deferring for 1 second to tell that. I directed a play with Joe Turner's Come and Gone, and he starred in it as a freshman at Stanford. And there's a character, if you remember Joe Turner's Come and Gone, a woman who has somewhat of a relationship with him, and this was played by another freshman, a woman named Ryan Bethay, and they started to date after the play. And then, as happens in college, they hated each other 2 years later and fell apart. But then after senior year, they both got into the MFA program in acting at NYU. So they went there and they said, hey, we're here together. And they fell in love again. Then they hate each other again. And then after they graduated from the MFA program at NYU, their first role was playing husband and wife in a commercial. So they said, what the hell, let's get married. And they're still married now. They have a lovely little boy and a second one on the way. So anyway, back to this in terms of this. So as we turned to this idea of aftermath, we have in the aftermath of rape, of genocide, of unspeakable horror and cruelty, it's about survival and composed of a world in which women have to be pragmatic and pick the lesser of many evils as they look to survive. And loosely, it's constructed around the notion of Bertolt Brecht, Mother Courage and her children. And I think one of the main places where you see that connection is in that central figure, that woman who will be devious, who will forget the past in a sense. She won't ask those questions, what if, because she wants to survive and has to keep pushing forward for herself, the women under her control. Right and wrong, and sometimes are turned upside down. The question is, what values are necessary simply to survive? The play is set in the Congolese whorehouse on the border of Uganda, and the proprietor attempts to shield her working girls from the bullets and brutalities of outside. And in this brothel, there's also a bar, and that's where much of the action sits. So I'm going to talk about that idea of the bar when I talk about Sweat in a little bit. The play confronts the human costs of the country torn apart by civil war. Evident is the personal cost as well, and the question of what one does, how one survives, and how the central figure, Mama, negotiates in this aftermath. Other pictures of ruin, and you see the bar in the background. Now with Sweat, one of the things we see in the aftermath right from the very beginning is the aftermath of this unspeakable crime that has happened. And the question for both Chris and John, even over the years they've been incarcerated, is how do they deal with this? How do they confront this? What happens now in terms of that? When the world is upended, also, how do they justify what happens with the rest of their lives? We also see this question in terms of the social dynamics, right? As we mentioned, the factory closing. And what do they do in the aftermath of that? I think it's interesting to see the parallels between Cynthia and Tracy. And when we see them both facing in the apartment, the set, for those who haven't seen, the set is wonderful. And the set that uses the same couch for their house. And to see where they've gone, in a sense, and where they've had to make life after this point afterwards. How do you keep surviving? Do drugs and booze figure into that as mechanisms in the aftermath of crisis to, in a sense, dull the pain and to help survival? But also in the aftermath of crisis, one of the interesting things you see is how identity is caught up into it, who they see themselves as. So Chris and Jason, you see the struggle with themselves. Who am I now in this world? Am I who I thought I was? How do I be the type of person I need to be, want to be, whatever? Jason makes the decision in prison, right? He becomes associated with white supremacists, and he has the tats on his face. And then we see in terms of his survival, on the other hand, Chris has turned to God, Jesus, and the Bible. So those choices in terms of identity and survival. Also, in terms of the women within the play, one of the interesting things, they both say this same line. They say, in the aftermath, they say, I'm a worker. And for being a worker, for Cynthia, what that means is she's going to do 3 jobs, even though she's not paid very well. But she's got to keep that sense of self. With Tracy, there's a sense of feeling frustrated with, I'm a worker. And what she turns to is drugs at that point and becomes strung out. So that sense of identity, how you see yourself, is one of the things in this question of in the aftermath of crises or trauma. Another part of it is with Chris at the very beginning. The question I mentioned before is that he asks himself, what if? What if I hadn't been there? What if I hadn't done that? What if that moment hadn't happened in life? I know we all see that what if question sometimes, right? About decisions we make. And so in this then, Nottage is asking that, and she's asking, can you go back? No, you can't. So what does it mean, in a sense, to hold on to that? that part of the play then, or part of the process in healing from trauma sometimes is letting go or finding a way to confront it differently. And that's part of the trajectory of these characters within the history of their history and within the action of the play. The next theme, race and class. Mentioned before that Nottage's work is political, but it's not didactic. It's not preachy in its exploration of the intersections of race, class, gender. So our characters are unsettled figures often in search of meaning within their own lives. Thus that idea of the what if that we've been talking about. How do you find meaning of who you are? Nottage is effective in making these dynamics have wider reverberation. So in Sweat, we see the structural dynamics of race and class inform the crisis and the construction of the characters. It's a question then of how they work within these factors. So interestingly, within this play, you've got, at the beginning in the 2000s, you've got white and black workers coming together in terms of class, right? So a working class coming together and working together. And it's interesting because it somewhat disrupts what we've seen historically in the United States. Historically, white and black workers have been, working class people have been pitted against each other back because that seemed to be a way to foment or keep difference. You could see it in the South early in terms of slavery, in the aftermath of what happened in terms of Reconstruction, but also in black cities after that were set upon by white working class. So that sense of the antagonism between them is something we saw, but it's something we don't see in this play at first. So we see the potential, for something different in terms of the view of working class and relationships. Then we see, as I said, how the outside or external forces impact the internal relationship. So Brucey's a wonderful case in point, right? He worked at the textile factory, and his history or story is one that we're about to see played out in the other characters, right? And what happens is he turns to drugs, and we see that in Tracy. So we see these cycles. And one of the cycles we also see is that he's in line to get a check or to get money from the union, and a white worker says that it's his fault that all of this has happened. So he came as a black worker, and they integrated the plant, and that history played out then. And then we see it playing out again as how they see Oscar. And Oscar then coming in as the new potential person who disrupts what was there, but and the ownership. So we see those antagonisms play out again and again. Oscar, I think, is a fascinating figure that we see that was born here, but yet seems like he's not to them, and they see him as a scab. And he has that wonderful line, "They don't even recognize me when I'm here." And the staging of it is great. Oscar's working all the way around, and he's not saying anything, and you see him peeling even gum off the bottom of the table, and so that sense of him trying to find a place for himself is critical to the action of the play. This scene I want to talk about for 1 second, because it wasn't in the script that was sent to us, and it's an interesting dynamic between father and son. And if I saw any moment of the play that's like August Wilson, this is it. It's very much like what play has anybody seen Jitney, the father and son dynamics there, or playing out is how the son sees his father, and the son sees his father, he has this memory of his father striking, and is seeing his father as big. And you can think of that image with little kids anyway, right? The father is much bigger than you. You look up to him, literally. But that idea of how father and son, and how the father really is trying to get the son to live a different life from him, to live different from his example, and how the son sort of in some ways follows into or falls into some of the same traps. Oscar is here, and Oscar is interesting in that in the bar, the role that Oscar plays at first invisible, but then he's become the proprietor of the bar. Now, I said I was going to mention a little bit about the dynamics of the structure of the play in terms of this idea of race and class and the space. And within the play, what you get is the bar that's there, and we see maybe some scenes within the houses that we mentioned, and we see the opening and a latter scene that is in the parole officer's space. But other than that, it's in the bar. And the one figure that's in the bar that's there, right, that doesn't really leave is Stan. So the sense of the bartender is the steady person. That's of the relationships that happen with other people. He's the steadying force. He tries to prevent the tragedy that's going to happen and inevitably gets caught up in it, right? And it's interesting that that stability is somewhat replicated when Oscar steps into that role. Okay, so he becomes that figure of stability, which is an interesting change. But what I call, it's one of my favorite words, you've got this environment that is the bar where people come and go, and the bar that I mentioned in Rune is similar. It's what I would call a liminal environment. A liminal environment is a place that's in between, betwixt and between. And liminality is an interesting phase. And I'll give you an idea of liminal. The idea of puberty is liminal. Puberty, you're between adulthood and childhood, that stage in between, and you think all the hormones are flushing, and yes, we can remember back then, I think, right? And then what a time it is. So the two important things about a liminal space or liminality, it contains both incredibly constructive potential and destructive potential in that liminal space. So that bar that they come into has creative energy, it has rituals, it has the birthdays that they play, it has the way they associate with each other back in 2000. It has also the potential for what erupts in 2008. So space and how she uses space is an interesting in terms of commenting on these ideas of race and class and they're coming together. Fabulation in terms of what she does in terms of race and class here, she focuses in on upper class African Americans who ignore their roots. So the central figure, Undine, she was a successful advertiser, but her husband absconds with her money and she's got to go live with her poor relatives in Brooklyn. And so it's about that in a sense. And then she says, Nottage of the character Undine, I read this article about Condoleezza Rice, and I said, this is exactly who I'm talking about. A person who has such a single-minded pursuit of success that they're willing to give up anything. I don't know if Condi ever read those comments, but I have a meeting with her next week. I'm not saying a thing. Now, Undine, incidentally, is named after Undine Sprague, a character from Edith Wharton's novel, The Custom of the Country, who moving to New York. Undine believes that to survive in the professional world, you have to sever ties to your family. So she loses identity to her family in order, she thinks, to survive. So it goes back to that sense of survival, struggle, whatever, but it's particularly about class and class within the African American community that she sends up. Other pictures of fabulation. In Crumbs, race and clash within the dynamics of family. Nottage contrasts the father, Godfrey's conservatism, with the activist ideology of his live-in sister-in-law, Lily Ann Green, who offers a different experience of spirit in her embrace of sexual freedom, women's rights, communism resistance. While Godfrey upholds temperance and abstinence, Lily drinks, parties freely, and does not suppress her sexuality. The family conflict between father and surrogate mother plays out in terms of repressed desire. Now, what happens, rather than turning to Lily, the symbol of decadence in his mind, following the death of his wife, Godfrey marries a white German woman, Goethe, here you see in this slide, following the path of his spiritual father and leader, Father Divine, who also married a white woman. Nottage explores the contours of this relationship at a time when interracial desire was particularly charged. Goethe herself struggles to find fulfillment with a brave new world as an outsider, a white German woman in a world where she is other. Nottage is one of the few contemporary playwrights looking at these questions of how interracial relations complicate our understanding of Blackness and of the Black experience and its historical legacy. Turning to this last thing, this idea of potential for hope and redemption. In Crumbs, each of the characters, as the figure that I said, the narrator, Ernestine expresses, seeks to escape and find a better life, to find sustenance and salvation, to experience the crumbs from the table of joy. And I love that picture, that you get that sense of exaltation. Now, Nottage faced some criticism for her ending in terms of ruined and seeing, but she's an optimist in some ways and sees and against the power of, again, the power of love, the possibility and the indomitability of the human spirit. And I think that's so important in Sweat. The last scene of Sweat, that was one of the for me, and I think I see people shaking their heads, a profound moment on stage. In terms of coming together, the four men. And I want to talk about a stage direction that we were sent to play that exists now, but a stage direction also that went away. So in the version that we read, the stage direction that went away was that Evan, the parole officer, brings Jason to the bar for that final scene. Now, wouldn't that have changed things? I mean, that sense of his own agency in coming there is huge. So I don't know how Lou may know how that changed. Yes, no? Well, anyway, it did. but it's a great, I mean, that the four of them are coming there, and we see a stage direction that exists is that it says apology is in their eyes. Right? And the actors played that so powerfully in terms of that dynamic. And then you get the last line, right? The last line from Oscar, the last line that I think moves us, that touches us. And I was going to remember verbatim, but I'll read it. That's how things ought to be, right? And the lights fade. That's how things ought to be. That sense of there can be hope, redemption. And it's a message in a sense that goes out to us and how we act and what we potentially take out of the theater. So I'm going to stop there in terms of talking about her work. And in the next 5 minutes, I'll talk, and then we'll open to questions. And that's also the time you might head up to the place. I'll talk about the Reading Project. So This is Reading is a bold, interactive multimedia experience in the heart of Reading, Pennsylvania. Site-specific, she's calling it a social sculpture that engages layered issues of the city, a poorest city in America, and the installation is set to investigate how the identity of a city like Reading and so many other cities in America have shifted over time. And so what I want to do in that idea is show you clips that she has, and you might go to her site to see. How do we flash on this? If I just, Thank you, Russell. So we'll watch a second of this.
I grew up in a trailer from about the age of 8 till I think the age of 12. I'm only 44 and I've experienced quite a bit. I'm a non-functioning addict when I use. I met a man, I was out bar hopping. This is how it started going downhill. And I started actually using cocaine with him in order to keep my addiction going 24/7, which is the way I've used 24/7. I did whatever it took to stay from being sick. I've had a luxurious lifestyle. I've also been on the streets and not had anything and have lost everything due to my addiction.
So I got to live off $43 a week. I'm 47. I'll be 48 in July. And I'm getting to that age where employers don't even want to hire me. I work out in that gym every other day. I got the body of a 25-year-old. I'm stronger than 90% of these guys in here. And I take pride in myself. I take pride in my body. I take pride in my mind. I take pride in everything that I have. And yet it's just getting ripped away. Piece by piece, it's getting ripped away.
Most people are afraid of things they don't know, and they stereotype. I've showed pictures of and said, hey, this guy's homeless. And they said, well, he doesn't look homeless. And I'm thinking, well, what do homeless people look like? They look like we do. I give food all throughout the week, in a month, counting the kids and some of the families, maybe 300 times a month. Anything from a sandwich and a bottle of water to a box of food. And every week I get new people, new families, young reservists, people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. I've done a lot of nasty, rotten stuff in my life. And before I got married, I said, I need to suffer. I think I need to be punished for just being a bad person. I want to quit sometimes, but I could never face myself not knowing where these guys are.
We'll stop there.
People are leaving, trying to find jobs.
So again, you can go to the site and hear other stories of Redding. She's shaping this into this, as I said, this social sculpture. It's going to be interactive. She's going to use actors, but also real community people in terms of this. But what I also find fascinating is you see some of those stories, how they shape, how they appear in terms of the characters informed her in writing the play. So we are open for a little while for questions, but also it's thank you. It's also quarter of if you need to get out. He's going to come. He'll.
Thank you. I saw Sweat, and I just thought it was the best thing I've seen this season. I loved the show. And I was.
Can you hear her in the back?
No. Oh, am I speaking? Oh, I saw Sweat, and I thought it was the best show I'd seen this season. I loved it. And I was curious about the character of Cynthia. You know, she has had these longstanding friendships with the white women she works with. And she, as an African-American woman, really is challenging herself to try to step into management. Now, whether she makes that transition successfully is up to debate. But she gets no support really from her white friend. She gets no support from her black husband. And I just wondered if you could comment on the struggles that black women have in order to sort of self-actualize when they are trying to move ahead and be upwardly mobile and move their families out of poverty.
Thank you. It's something, and I'm going to, Michelle in her talk yesterday spoke a little bit about Cynthia in interracial working relationships. And what she pointed out is it's inversion of what we normally see. So you normally saw, in a sense, a white woman working, a black woman working for white woman as a nanny, et cetera, as a domestic. And so it reverses that relationship. And it's interesting that one of the things we see when that is reversed, immediately Tracy says, well, she got the position because she's a minority. You know, so that sense of rupture within the friendship, and how friendships are impacted by external factors, be it race, be it environment, as much as anything else, comes out in terms of what happens to their relationship. What is true also is there is the complications in her position by both, not only her her husband, her Cynthia, but her son. You know, her son who wants to, in a sense, look to the mother to do the right thing. And you see their frayed relationship that happens. The husband who's having too many of his own problems to really be supportive in the ways that are necessary. So in terms of the historical picture or the question that you asked about support, the black women in America right now remain, unfortunately, in terms of the economic situation, in a lower economic position often than others, than white women, than black men. Black women are also least likely to marry, which is we have a friend who wrote a book about black women marry. So that's another dynamic that may shape, the interaction. But on the same level is that one of the things you've seen is within that experience of black women is a sense of resilience, which we talked about in the aftermath here. How do you survive and struggle? It dates, you could say, back to the time of being a domestic. Angela Davis, in a book on black women, talks about the domestic as a space of power and how they use that space. And you might think of it, the domestic as a space of power, not simply for black women, but for women. But for black women, what she's talking about is the ability to control the kitchen. You control what people eat. You can kick them out of their own kitchen in the house. The sense of what you do and how you do it. So what I see within the historical pictures, trying to find some ways where you find power and feel good about yourself within that. We see that in Cynthia, and the last thing I'll say about that is Cynthia, with Cynthia, with Oscar, we get these wonderful speeches about how they see and rationalize where they are. You know, this is what she wanted. She wanted a chance to have a desk job. She wanted something beyond. She had that sense of aspiration and feels like she should be able to do it. She knows more than some others in terms of what she could do within the factory. So her sense of self then becomes more richly fulfilled within there, but also ironically becomes problematic in terms of her relationship with others. So it's I think wonderful writing that we see in the picture of Cynthia. Yes, in the way back.
Thank you for this really wonderfully insightful lecture. Two things. One is we're a predominantly sort of middle-age audience here, and I was with a friend. Sorry.
Thank you for. We all thank you for that.
Well, I put myself there too, and I saw the play with a friend who's 21 years old. And earlier in your talk, you said, "And of course we know what happened in 2000, and of course we know what happened in 2008." And she didn't, and she did not understand a lot of the play. This is a play like Ruined, where you really have to do research beforehand or attend a lecture to understand it if you're younger than a certain age, because they don't know these things.
That's it. Linda Paulson is sitting here, who teaches a class for us at Stanford called Sophomore College, that on Monday they arrive 15 sophomores. So, and what is it called? The student CSC. What does it stand for? Assistant is here as well. So we'll be very, very interested in what your charges think of this play and how they respond. In reading it, I'm sorry and I'll get back to your question. In reading it, you get the dates 2000, 2008, April, May. You see the progression in reading it. So I was looking for and wondering how they were going to do that in the staging. Were you able to follow that?
Yes.
We have two younger. I'm going to ask you two your thoughts after we finish our question.
Just one more thing. I think one of the things that really grabbed me and hit me in the stomach was the undercurrent in terms of race between the friends, because you have Tracy and Cynthia, who have been the best of friends. And yet, as soon as Cynthia rises in management, the first thing Tracy says is it's because she's a minority. You have Chris and Jason, who are they're like brothers, right? And then you have Jason in the parole office calling the parole officer nigger and going to white supremacy. And frankly, I had a really hard time understanding that. I'm a white woman, what can I say? But how is it that relationships that are that close can have that kind of racial undercurrent still there?
Michelle, will you answer that? It's a great question. Because she spoke about interracial relationships yesterday.
No, you should answer it, because there's a lot of people in the audience who we had this conversation about then too, which is that even in the most intimate relationships, sometimes
Michelle, you can't hear you up here. Speak into the mic.
In the most intimate relationships, they can be the crucible for racism as well. So that I opened up the talk yesterday talking about how oftentimes people pose interracial relations of that intimacy as an oasis of light above and beyond politics, race, and circumstances. And I think that she's very I don't know how other people thought about it, but Sweat was very compelling in sort of showing that that's not a refuge, that's where that those aren't free from the constraints and stuff, and that they're just below the surface. So it's not the answer or the resolution, but you're right, it makes it so much more powerful.
Yeah, and related to that, I think, is Chris and Jason's, that even after the prison and trying to stay away from each other, they've got this confrontation when they see each other, and what do? They hug. So that's something that is maybe, there's a potential beyond this. I was going to ask, we have two young people up here, and so you're helping the age demographics here, so thank you for their average. What did you all think? And were you able to follow that in terms of 2000, 2008 and the context?
Well, I had never really, the only time I had heard of NAFTA was from a textbook. So there was definitely not a lot of personal stories tied to that for me, and I think it was really, really enlightening in the play to actually see how that played out. So that was the big thing that I came away with. I don't know. Yeah,
and then Tracy's got that great line about NAFTA. What is it? A laxative? Yeah. What next to you? How about for you?
I kind of heard of these things in the background, but it was never really a focus for me at all. Like 2008, I remember very clearly, but less so 2000. But it was interesting to see this story from kind of like the ground up, as she mentioned yesterday.
Yeah, and I think what you potentially get then is it happening on many levels. So you've got the human, the personal level, and then you've got the personal, as they used to say in the 70s, as political, to see those dynamics that shape a different context around it. And I know some of you may go back or have seen it more than once, and I think you're going to pick up things within that in the viewing of it potentially again. Any other questions? We have a couple more minutes. Yes.
Yeah. Following up on the question there, besides the fact that this group is "quote unquote" middle-aged, yeah, speak for myself. Yeah. Oh, speaking of the mic. There's also the reality that the audience at OSF is not the class that's being portrayed on the stage. Mm-hmm. And besides the fact that we may feel that we understand what's going on in the action, I think she writes it very well. There is an experience of class that I imagine, and again, I'm making an assumption here, most of the people in this room don't have any direct experience of. And so and what I think was powerful about the play is that she still conveyed it in a way that was very universal. But I wonder how much, I wonder how much presenting this play to an audience that was of a different class, that was of, the working class, of the class that, experienced these things. That's something that, it's not just that NAFTA's in the textbook. Most of us here haven't had to directly, I think, experience what the reconstruction of this economy has gone through in the last 15, 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so it was very hard for me. I was thinking a lot about the fact that many of us have actually been benefited by the policies that has destroyed these people's lives. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, I don't know.
Clinton talked about NAFTA as a panacea that was going to help, right? A couple of points on your question or comment. One, in terms of what you call the universal, the cross-cultural. Lorraine Hansberry said that, and actually she said it, but she was quoting other people, that the way you get to that universal is being incredibly specific, right? So we get this play that's specific to Reading, that's specific to people, that's specific to class, and then we get these great questions that potentially touch us all on a cross-cultural human level. So that's one thing that I think she does effectively. Two, in terms of the idea of audience, we all bring baggage, right, to a play. And it's an interesting thing in terms of that baggage. It's going to shape our experience individually, but it also has a dynamic that impacts us. What's great about theater is a communal and collective thing. Like last night, we gave it a standing ovation, right? We all collectively did that. And sometimes the standing ovation isn't only about that the play was great. It's about we were a great audience. We did a great job watching that, didn't we? So you've got that collective experience in terms of that. So the audience, but the personal baggage that shapes it is another factor in your question. And so that makes experience individual, and we see different things within it based on our class, our race, whatever, and experience. But also the last thing is in terms of she's doing a reading of this back in Reading. Is that right? Yes? So I'd be really interested to see what sort of action that gets from the crowd. Michelle has something she wants to say.
It was just exactly that, which is a response to your things that she's going through Reading, as I understand it.
Precisely because you just don't want to have a play about a community that's represented and they're not actually participants in it. Yeah. So she is trying to think about theater differently. So I think that was really prescient.
And that's part of the inspiration too of this This Is Reading project. Have time for one more question? Was it one more hand? Well, we get two more and we'll do it quick. Is that okay, Robert?
This play has made me think a lot. And the one question I came up with in my mind was that if in the process of getting the job, if Tracy had gotten the job rather than Cynthia, would Cynthia have reacted the same way Tracy did?
It's funny. Somebody asked the same question yesterday, and so I think it comes up. And I'll give the dynamics of race in and around it don't change. And the question of what would Tracy have done is an interesting one too. Would she have been on the side of the union? Would she have helped her friends? So the idea of how much your actions are shaped by your position, are shaped by the context within you work, are shaped by how you identify as that job. I mean, we can think of it to extrapolate from that job on the factory to other jobs, policemen. How much does your identity get caught up into that position, and that you act in some ways on your own, but in some ways an expectation of what is expected of you in that position. So we see that playing out somewhat in terms of Cynthia. The friendship, though, and the freight, that would have been the more conventional expectation, right, that we mentioned before. And it was one of the questions, though, with it is that with it, if that traditionally had happened, would you too have felt that Cynthia was done wrong in terms of appointing her, that she seems in some ways, the way the action plays out, like she's the right person for it, right? So you might feel that sense of loss for her as well. There's a question up here.
Thank you. That was an incredibly rich and enriching exposition, Professor Elam. The question I've got is, you mentioned the what if in the context of, in the aftermath of crisis. Mm-hmm. So you got existential stuff happening, you've got personal identity stuff happening. And I was just thinking, as you said that about Bill Rausch one time asking when he came here before he got the position of artistic director, what if you combine the resources of this amazing place with defining moments in American history? And that became, of course, American Revolutions, or the seed for that, I should say. So do you think that's at play? Am I reading that right, that in Lynn Nottage's work, there's what if that's like retrospective, like what if I'd done things differently? It's kind of more like remorse. And there's what if that, hey, what if I did such and such? Could my life be different? Mm-hmm. Does it toggle, do you think? Is there what if in her thinking, the hope and redemption aspect? I
think it's both. And I think in this play we see both. But I want to pick up on the first part of you said, the what if about Bill Rausch. It's simply that I unabashedly think he's brilliant, And I think he's done incredible work here in thinking about what if and what can I create. The revolutions to have this play, this play's going places. I'm given the review in the New York Times to have the success of the LBJ plays. So this series, and when you do plays that are commissioned, a good hit percentage is like maybe 10, maybe up to 20%. This series has hit maybe 40% or more. And then I think one of the things you're blessed with at Ashland is you all. This is the best theater audience. It's amazing what's built in here. So, my wife and I love coming up here. So the opportunity to do so. But in answer to your question, I think we see both parts for Nottage. There was one other question, and we'll end on this note.
Yeah, I just simultaneous with seeing Sweat, I'm reading. I don't know how to say his name, but the author of Between the World and Me, Coates.
Tennessee Coates.
Yeah, and just real quick from that book, Americans deify democracy in a way that allows for a dim awareness that they have from time to time stood in defiance of their God. And there's a part of Christian me that wants to see a trinity at the end of the play rather than
the four of them.
Rather than two young men hiking. I want it to be larger. I don't want it to be as simple as that policeman and that little white kid who, that famous image we have. Yeah.
Well, I think in terms of this ending, thank you for that. And if you know this, the book, it's a quick read. It's a book. Am I pronouncing his name right? Michelle Tanishi. My last name is Coates, spelled Coates. Also, it was plugged by Toni Morrison, thank you. Toni Morrison said he's the next Baldwin, and which is incredibly high praise. And from my wife, who's written a book on Baldwin, maybe too much praise. But nonetheless, one of the things he's asking in the first part of that book is the power of history, and how does history, in a sense, impact on how we act out currently. And I think that's a question we see too with the work of Nottage within this play. But in terms of that last moment, you know, you can read it potentially as a Christian and as a potential moment there, as the lights go out. I mean, it is a spiritual question. What is Oscar's line again? Somebody? Yeah, that's, I mean, in terms of Judaism, Christianity, you can see that type of theme playing out, right? And so, and that's what the lights go out on. So I think she leaves that, and we mentioned the baggage of the audience, she leaves that space for us, you know, to make that, that sort of leap to the spiritual. But the potential is there. Thank you all. Thanks for coming.
And thank you for those on the web.
Enjoy the rest of your time here.